Good evening. I'm Todd Lefkoe, Chairperson of East-West Connections. Thank you for participating in our outstanding webinar featuring two distinguished diplomats, Mark Jorgensen and Ambassador John Carwile. I wish to thank our co-sponsors, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, Macalester College Russian Studies Department, the Museum of Russian Art, Global Minnesota, and Zerkalo, the Russian media. If you have questions, please send them through the chat function. Without further ado, I introduce Minnesota's favorite son, the Honorable Mark Jorgensen. Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Todd. High standards to live up to. We are very honored tonight to have John Carwile with us to talk about, in particular, Latvia and the Baltic countries. John served as the U.S. ambassador to Latvia from 2019 to 2023. Ambassador Carwile retired from the senior foreign service in 2023 with the personal rank of minister counselor. Over his 35 years of service, John served in places like Brunei, Nepal, Rome, Baghdad, Ottawa, Belfast, Peru, Malaysia, Italy, and Ecuador. So we're very lucky to have Ambassador Carwile with us. John, welcome to Minnesota. Welcome to East-West Connections.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Todd, and I want to thank East-West Connections for hosting me tonight.
So let's get started right away. John, I know that a lot of people are interested in the Baltics. You had the opportunity to serve as ambassador in Latvia for a number of years. I don't think one can start talking about Latvia without understanding its history, specifically its independence being negotiated away in 1940, and it's becoming part of the former Soviet Union for over 50 years. How does this play into Latvia's current internal and external politics and culture? Can you help our audience understand how that history plays into today's Latvia?
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, you're right in that Latvia's long association or dominance by Russia and then the Soviet Union has played a large part in their current politics and their current outlook in terms of foreign policy. As you mentioned, well, it was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the late 1930s. They divided spheres of influence, Stalin and Hitler. First, it was the Germans. The Soviets that came in, they deported some 34,000 Latvians in a very short period of time. Then the Nazis, and then the Red Army swept through again and took over Latvia. And so it was Soviet domination from then until the early 1990s, again with massive deportations, collectivization of agriculture. A lot of transplanted Russian workers were moved into Latvian territory. And a lot of suppression of the Latvian language, Latvian culture, Latvian identity, which had been very important before, when they got their independence after World War I. And so when independence came again in the early 1990s, the Latvians were in a majority. And so they were able to form the governments from then until now. And one of the main motivating factor in all these coalition governments, and they've always been coalition governments, is to keep out pro-Russian parties in the governing coalition. And so that's been one of the major themes, if you will, of the last, 35 years in terms of internal politics, is to promote Latvian culture, Latvian identity, Latvian politics, as well as turning towards the West and away from Russia. And so they joined the EU, as you know, in 2004. They joined NATO in 2004. And so that shift, and it wasn't just Latvia, it was Estonia, Lithuania as well. They wanted to lessen their ties to Russia. They were really tied economically in many ways, historical ways. And that it didn't really start to end until first the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and then the first invasion of Crimea in 2014, and then it was accelerated with the second invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So that shift has continued politically and economically, in the last few years that was started after the second independence in the early 1990s.
Mhm. Okay. You talked a little bit about the shift away from Russia. So how does that history of being part of the Soviet Union, Russia, Soviet Union for 50 plus years, how do Latvians respond to Russia today? When you talk about things like border security, domestic politics, NATO membership, how has that past history really focused them on what they do today?
Well, they just want to reinforce those ties to the West that they've established. I mean, most importantly is NATO, of course, and the collective defense. They strongly feel that if it weren't for NATO, is that they would be in Russia's sights. They would perhaps have already been invaded by Putin, and that that NATO defense guarantee is basically what has kept them independent. But they have an interesting dynamic, as I'm sure you're aware of, and Estonia has it well too, is that there's a lot of there are a lot of Russians, ethnic Russians in Latvia, up to, it depends on how you count them, about a third of the population, and even more in Latvia have Russian as their mother tongue. And so this is a dynamic that that the Latvian government, the Latvian leadership has had to balance, because these are citizens as well of Latvia, and they want to be respectful of that culture and that history. But also they see that as a dynamic that has to be managed, especially because it's only natural, it's only human nature, is that one will identify with their native tongue, with what could be their native culture, that sort of thing. And so they're very much aware of what they would consider possibly a threat from Russia that uses this culture, these ethnic Russians that live in Latvia.
Okay, and as part of that, with the Russian speakers, have the Latvians done a fairly good job of integrating those Russian speakers? Are there still Russian media outlets available, or has that started to change over the last few years?
Yeah, since the invasion, the second invasion of Ukraine, that has really changed. Whereas the Latvian government, while I was there as ambassador, and has continued since, they've shut down, Russian TV, Russian satellite transmissions into the country, that sort of thing. But in this day and age in media, social media and the internet, it's difficult to completely shut that off. The government has also tried to reduce the official use of Russian in the country. Like, it's no longer taught in schools. It's no longer, it's no longer a language for government, those sorts of things. But it's still prevalent because, I mean, in Riga alone, which is by far and away the largest city in the country with over half the population, half the people are native Russian speakers there.
Okay. All right. Just a reminder for people out there listening, if you do have questions, please use the chat function to ask their questions, and we will get to those towards the end of the program. Changing things just a little bit. Americans, I would say, probably likely think of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as this contiguous area within Europe that's kind of all the same. Most Americans may not even be aware that all three countries have their own language. How do the countries differ from one another, and how is that affected in regional affairs between each country and as NATO members? And how closely did you work with your counterparts in Lithuania and Estonia as ambassador when you were in Latvia?
That's a good question. Also, well, let me answer the first part last, is that I was in close communication, as you know, from your diplomatic career too, is that oftentimes neighboring countries, you'll be in close contact, especially in a small region like the Baltics, with your counterparts in the other capitals. Bob Gilchrist, who was a good friend of mine, was the ambassador in Lithuania when I was there. We only had a charge d'affaires in Estonia, so my deputy was coordinating with the mission up there. But the U.S. foreign policy towards Latvia and towards the Baltics was relatively similar in terms of its defense policy, largely run through NATO, and our economic policies largely run through the EU and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of coordination, but there wasn't a lot of difference in terms of U.S. policy vis-a-vis these three Baltic countries. But as you mentioned, the three countries are different, but they tend to group themselves together as well on mutual interests such as defense. And we saw that after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was incredibly close cooperation between the three Baltic countries on defense. That a lot of that, withered away or went away when they joined NATO because they didn't need to do that, because they see their best defense as being part of a collective, whether it's NATO, whether it's speaking, together as one on Baltic matters. And so some of their air defense policies and initiatives are taken together. The leadership, the highest levels, will meet twice a year and the respective capitals. So there's a lot of close coordination and communication, between the countries, especially as they look out foreign policy and defense policy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You were ambassador in Latvia during the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. What was that like, both from a embassy standpoint, being in that part of the world, but also the feedback you got from your Latvian contacts? And how does Latvia look at the war in Ukraine, especially given their past history with the Soviet Union?
Yeah. Well, not to be flip about it, but it's a very exciting time, but not in a good way. First, speaking about the embassy, thankfully, we had a lot of very seasoned diplomats there, people who were very good at their jobs. So they did not really pay attention to what was going on in terms of, is it a danger to the embassy, that sort of thing, or to them. But that can't still be, that the same cannot be said about the Latvian people or writ large. There was a general concern, worry, if you will, especially in the early days when everybody, not everybody, but many people thought that Putin would have, as he was thinking, a 3-day invasion, be able to take Kyiv. And so there was a lot of fear in Latvia, concern in Latvia is probably a better word, about would Ukraine fall? But I will tell you, and I'll come back to that, I'll tell you within the government of Latvia, they would tell me that no. The Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian government, they're very tough, and it's not going to be easy. And they will be able to push back the Russian invasion, and they were right. But given the concern that was in Latvia, and especially would NATO come, if there's going to be a problem, and specifically would the United States come? And it can't be emphasized enough just how important the relationship between that, Latvia and the other Baltic countries place on the United States. It's the most important relationship they have in terms of their security guarantee. That's what they believe. This could be changing now a little bit because we have a new administration, a different, what appears to be, at least in some regards, a different perspective. So there's a little shift. But the United States was considered the ultimate guarantor of Latvian security, of Baltic security. So one of the things that I did, and I had other people in my embassy do, is we went out and did a lot of public outreach in those first days, first weeks, to reassure the Latvian public of the United States commitment. I would go on national TV, go on radio, do interviews with newspapers, that sort of thing, give speeches around the country to reinforce the United States commitment. And it was coming directly from the president. I mean, he specifically said, we will defend every square inch of NATO territory. And so these are the sorts of things that I would do when I went out to help reassure. And of course, the Latvian government officials are saying roughly the same thing. And one last point is right after the invasion, President Biden sent 1,600 paratroopers within 12 hours from northern Italy. He sent them there in the middle of the night to Latvia to reassure both the Latvian government and the Latvian people of the United States commitment.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about the defense partnerships, because the current administration's budget proposal has a severe cut for what's called the Baltic Security Initiative, which provides funding to help solidify security in 3 Baltic countries. What's sort of the current status as you understand? Are there still those 1,600 paratroopers in Latvia? Are there other partnerships that are in place now? Have other NATO countries helped to sort of provide some of that security guarantee for Latvia and the Baltics?
Yeah, let me touch on the last part first, and then I'll come back to the legislation. So, no, there are not that many American troops there now. One is because it's not our primary role. In Latvia, as in Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, there are NATO advanced forward presence posts. And in Latvia, it's the Canadians who lead. It's the British in Estonia, and it's the Germans in Lithuania, and of course, the United States leads in Poland. So at Adige, it's a military base in Latvia. The advanced forward presence post is mostly Canadian soldiers, Spanish soldiers, and I think it's 9 or 10 other NATO member countries are there. So you're talking about, I think it's about, they've expanded it now. I'm trying to think. I think it's over between 2,000 and 3,000 troops there now, and different. But it's basically it's like if there ever were an invasion, the idea is this would not be enough to repel any sort of mechanized or invasion from Russia, but it shows that that the NATO alliance is there, and it's a tripwire, for lack of a better word. But I think it was the Baltic Security Initiative. Is that what you were saying? So my understanding is that the White House has submitted their defense proposal, and this was not included this year. And I think it's around $230 million, give or take, every year, or it's been. And without going too deep in the weeds, it's basically about trying to fill gaps between what the Baltics military capabilities are and some of the other members of NATO. And it's also done in consultation with the United States, where we think that they should be concentrating on. It's done, what they would spend this money on. And recently it's been on like rockets and HIMARS systems, ATACs, those types of things, looking at that to possibly spend the money on, or at least when I was there. I don't know in the last couple of years. That's where they were going with it. My understanding is that both in the House and in the Senate, there are motions or legislations to put that money back in. And I was perusing some recent news about what is the reaction from the Baltic countries, including one, I think it was the Estonian defense minister, said, look, it's important to us. A few years ago, it would be more important than it is now because we've upped our spending, we Estonia and the other Baltics. It's important to show United States commitment to the Baltics militarily, but it's not decisive like it was before. But they also say is that, look, nothing is final until Congress passes whatever appropriations are going to be and sends the bill up to the president to sign. So we've seen, you and I are very familiar with this, Mark, is that it doesn't really, it's important, whatever the framework is, it comes from the White House, but then Congress messes around with things or fixes things up and puts back in or takes things out. But in this case, we'll be putting back in. And so we'll see what will happen. But I was happy to see that J-Bank, which is very good at, messaging and is pressing the issue. And I also know that how good that the Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian embassies are in Washington with their contacts on the Hill. So I'm mildly optimistic it'll be in there.
Okay, good. Um, Switching subjects just a little bit, help us understand how Latvians look at the United States. Positive, neutral, negative. Has that changed over time? And if it has, what sort of was the genesis of that change?
Yeah, well, I already I touched on it a little bit. I hope I don't repeat myself too much, but the United States is the most important, ally of Latvia and the other Baltic countries, simply because we're so big and we can project force, and we are the ultimate security guarantee for them. But that said, it's important to remember, World War II again, and the aftermath of World War II. There was a Sumner-Welles Declaration where the acting Secretary of State, Sumner-Welles, said, we do not recognize the Soviet occupation of the Baltics, including Latvia. And this was very important to them because throughout the Soviet occupation, we still considered, we did not recognize that. We still considered them independent states. And they did not forget that. That was important to them. But also, there was a great diaspora after the Second World War. I mean, all the countries of Europe, but in particular, we're talking about the Baltics. They went west, displaced persons camps. They would go to Sweden. They went to Germany, but a lot of them went to Canada, and many, many went to the United States. In Chicago, where I live now, there's a huge Lithuanian community. When I was living in Washington, there's a big Latvian community there. And so they were always preserving the culture, always protesting, or especially in the Latvia case, against the Soviet occupation, keeping this freedom, this idea of a Latvian and free Baltic states alive. And it may be changing now, but just to give you a few examples, people went back to Latvia after the Soviets left. Like the first ambassador was Ojar Kalniņš, who was from Chicago, lived in Chicago for many years, became a good friend of mine. He became the first Latvian ambassador to Washington. And then he later became a member of parliament. He passed away a few years ago. His wife now, who has family in New York, she's now in parliament. The prime minister, when I was there, Krišjānis Kariņš, he grew up in Delaware. And so you have these sorts of connections to the West. President Levitz, his connection was in Germany. So you had these connections with this generation, very important. But I would think that now that those connections, and I would leave it to people who are more expert or still in Latvia, they might be slowly dissipating just because of age, and it's the next generation that's moving in. But the idea of the United States is still very, very strong. I haven't been there for a couple of years, so I don't know how it's reacting to the current political environment or foreign policy of the United States, but it's always been a warm, very positive relationship.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let's change real quick again, pivot to trade.
Okay.
Talk about trade between the U.S. and Latvia. Are there specific segments that do better than others?
Yeah.
Materials, tech. Talk about trade for a little bit.
Yeah. I cannot speak for Latvia or Lithuania because I'm not real familiar with their trading relationships, but the trading economic relationship between Latvia and the United States is pretty small. In terms of Latvian exports, I think the United States is like 10th or 11th largest market. In terms of, from the United States perspective, which is when I was ambassador, I was more interested in because I wanted to promote U.S. industry and businesses, we were like 20th or 21st on the list. And there is a small, but probably not by Latvian standards, trade surplus that Latvia enjoys. It's like 250, 300 million euros, something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's primary. They do a lot of wood product exports, some precision electronics, those sorts of things. And then, if I recall correctly, they import from the United States some fuel, some aircraft parts, some other, and also precision electronics. There's not a lot of trade there, and there's a lot of concern about tariffs that the Trump administration has put on different countries. there's not individually on Latvia. It's through the EU.
Mhm.
You know whatever tariffs would be, and so there probably wouldn't be much direct to Latvia because of their products. But I know the Bank of Latvia has done some work, some modeling on that, and because of secondary supply chains, with Germany and other members of the EU, they estimate that if the tariffs go through or stick around, it could shave off a half a percentage point to a percentage point of GDP, which is significant in any economy. But until it actually plays out, we won't really know on that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But if talking about sticking on economics a little bit, it's so much is Latvia, like Estonia and Lithuania, suffers from depopulation, if you will. They're within the European Union. I think Latvia's number one, Lithuania may be number two, Estonia's like fourth or fifth in terms of the highest rates of what we call depopulation. People, young people who are, speak multiple languages, including English. They have very good skills. They're well educated. They're going west to the for the better jobs, if you will. I won't say the more developed countries in Europe, but better jobs, higher paying jobs, whether it's Germany, whether it's France, whether it's the Netherlands or Norway, Sweden. They're leaving the country. And so this combined with a declining birth rate or a relatively low birth rate causes its own set of economic issues that the government's well aware of. And the previous prime minister, and I assume the current prime minister, is trying to reverse that, trying to attract businesses, high tech, especially in microprocessing sorts of things and software development. But it hasn't, as far as I know, it hasn't really gained a lot of traction yet.
Right. And part of what's happened within the EU itself is the migration, North Africa, some Central European, Eastern European migration. Is that also happening in Latvia?
No, not so much. I think when you may have been in Belarus at the time, there was some of this hybrid, what we would call tax or migration, if you will, through Belarus into the Baltics, where by hook or by crook or by lies and such, that economic migrants would be taken from, say, or enticed to come from Syria or Iraq to Belarus and then pushed across the border into the Baltics. And so when I was there, this was a big concern. They've largely shut that down. But in terms of migration from other parts of Africa or the Middle East, when I was there, it was not a problem.
Okay. I want to jump back to defense a little bit. Recently, I heard a speaker opine that Russians believe that if Russia invaded the Baltic countries, that Article 5 wouldn't work. I'm assuming they mean by that NATO ultimately wouldn't come to the aid of the 3 Baltic countries.
Mm-hmm.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, I believe we would, but I can understand the concerns or why the Russian colleagues of yours might think that. And I think that's one thing that Mr. Putin is doing now is he's sort of testing the waters, if you will, probing here and there. And we saw that with the drones that flew into Poland. The Poles shot them down. We had the excursion of Russian jet fighters into Estonia in most recent days. So I think, and we've had a lot of, if you will, testing in the Baltic Sea by the Shadow Fleet that's perhaps carrying out some activities in the Baltic Sea, and on communication lines, on other kind of infrastructure. So I think that there's a lot of disinformation testing that's going on now, cyber things, probably probing of infrastructure, critical infrastructure. So these sorts of things are going on now to see what the response would be. And I was pleased to hear, just in the last few days, the President Trump on Sunday, and then we had Secretary of State Rubio on the 23rd, and then echoed by the UN ambassador, new UN ambassador Waltz, that the United States, the last two said specifically that the United States would defend every square inch of NATO territory. So that was refreshing to hear. And then we know that President Trump met President Zelensky in New York. And after that meeting, and he also met, after that meeting, President Trump, voiced more support than he sometimes has this year for Ukraine, and that Ukraine could take back all of its territory. And I think this was welcome news by many, including President Zelensky. We'll see what that actually means, because we've seen or been following President Trump since he came in office, that sometimes the message that he gives changes from month to month. How does he feel about Russia? How does he feel about Mr. Zelensky? And that first meeting in the White House, when he berated Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, was not a good sign for U.S. resolve and, support of Ukraine. But give credit where credit's due in the last few days. That seems to have changed. It would be great if the United States started supplying aid again and arms, as was done in the previous administration. But let's take it step by step. But right now, it's a little bit better messaging, and I think that's been welcome in Europe. One thing I think, there's lots of things I disagree with President Trump about, but I will point out that the leaders of the Baltics have praised President Trump this year, because they believe that he has, through his messaging, through his actions, through his talks with other European leaders, has forced the other members of NATO to increase their defense spending. And this is something that the Baltics have wanted for many, many years. I mean, and Poland, they have very high defense spending as relative to their GDP. They're well over the 2% point. Poland's like 4.5% of their GDP. Lithuania's like 4%. Estonia and Latvia are in the high 3 percentage points, and they're going to go up even higher next year. So they wanted the other NATO members to up their defense spending. And so that's one thing that they're complimentary of the president. That said, there's a lot of concern about where the United States will be as the months go on with the war in Ukraine, and will they be supportive of Ukraine to the fullest extent possible.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you to gaze in your crystal ball just a little bit, which sometimes as a diplomat is not the best thing in the world to do, but
we're former diplomats, Mark.
Oh, that's right. So now it's okay. I'm with you. One of the things that I've heard is that, of course, there are a number of reasons that Russia cannot, be allowed to win the war in Ukraine. But one of them is that, after taking Ukraine, they would move next into Moldova and then take a look at the Baltic countries. As you gaze into a crystal ball, is that something that would even be possible in the realm of today's sort of world politics?
Yes. I mean, we've seen so many norms that have been pushed aside in recent years, or even the last year. We didn't think, there were so many people in Europe that didn't think that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. We did. And there's been a lot of reporting in the open press after the invasion that based on, when you go back and look at it, we thought so. The United States thought that this was quite likely. And when we would go to talk, and again, this is open source and in the public domain, is that the closer a country was to Russia, the more receptive they were to, the information we were, and our viewpoints we were giving. And the further west you went in Europe, the less, believable they thought that it was that Putin would invade Ukraine. I will say that the Latvians and the other Baltics, they firmly believe that without the NATO security guarantees, they would have been in Moscow's sights, and they could have been now part of, subject to Russian occupation again. And they look at the Crimea example, especially in 2014, as a prime example of what could happen to them. Not so much an overt invasion as there was in 2022, but the infiltration by special forces. There's pro-Russian militia there. There was a large Russian-speaking population, just such as there is in Estonia and Latvia. There was misinformation. There was isolation of Crimea, and the Russians were able to hold it. They could see something like that happening again. I'm sure they've gamed this sort of thing out where they could perhaps avail themselves of Russian-speaking population there, or use them as a pretext to protect ethnic Russians in their country. They could use, there could be an accident or a mistake that's made, with shooting down of aircraft or something that happens in the Baltic Sea that could be used as a pretext. So I'm sure they're worried about this. It's possible. Of course it's possible. But that's where the United States and NATO has to be resolute and complete, and always repeating over and over that we will protect every inch of NATO territory and back it up with credible deterrence.
And based on your experience, you feel that at least at this point, maybe not necessarily earlier, but at this point, Latvia, the Baltic countries are sort of ready to provide that defense. You talked earlier about maybe being a tripwire, but maybe at least to be that first flank, should that happen.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mark, you broke up. I only got part of that, but yes, they will fight, but they're very small. I mean, there's only 1.8 million people in Latvia. Estonia is even smaller, 1.2. Lithuania is a bit bigger, 2.6 million. You're not talking large populations, but of course, yes. If they're, knock wood, in the unlikely event of an actual Russian invasion, yes, of course, they would fight.
Okay. Let me, we have a few questions here, and for those in the audience, if you do have questions for Ambassador Carwile, please utilize either the chat function or the question and answer function. I've got a couple of here. Let me pull them up. The first question, as you mentioned, a lot of the population in the Baltic states is ethnically Russian, meaning that the Russian language and ethnic Russians make up a significant part of the contemporary identity of the three different Baltic states. Wouldn't you say that eliminating the diffusion of Russian language in the Baltics is like battling against who the Baltics are de facto right now?
I'm not sure I understood that question exactly, but the percentages, in Estonia, it's like 30% are Russians, more or less. In Latvia, maybe a little bit more. Lithuania, it's less than 10%. So you're not talking, the majority of the population. And so, these countries, I'll speak about the Latvia perspective, is that they're not trying to eliminate the Russian culture, Russian language. They just want to make sure that the Latvian identity, the Latvian language, the Latvian country, the Latvian independence is maintained.
Okay. Question from Joel Quee. How did the Estonian diplomatic corps respond to the removal of the U.S. ambassador and staff to Ukraine in 2020?
I'm not familiar with that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure I'm familiar with that either. Joel, if you have some more details on that, send them to us and we'll try to see if we can address that. The next question, this is a good question. What is the value of the Baltic states, specifically Latvia, to the leadership of Russia beyond the desire for conquest, ego? What do they provide Russia? For example, Ukraine extends the wheat production belt for Russia, increasing its market share.
Well, I would leave it more towards Russian experts like Todd and perhaps you, Mark, to respond. But a couple of things is um, my understanding is that Putin and other people of his mindset believe that the Baltics are natural part of Russia, of the Russian Empire, if you will, of an expansive Russia. They would also give them, I mean, they have Kaliningrad, which is the unshakable aircraft carrier, as it's been called, but it would also give them more security, or they, in their view, more security at the Baltics, into the Baltic Sea, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Talking about the Baltic Sea, Latvia has a fairly long coastline along the Baltic Sea.
Mm-hmm.
How do they use that? The Baltic Sea is one of those deep water ports that stays open. Do the Latvians capitalize on that? How do they utilize that? Do they have a 12-month-a-year port that they're able to utilize?
Well, they don't utilize it as much as they would like to, and part of that is because of the lack or of trade with Russia now. A lot in the back for many, many years, Russian exports would go to Latvian ports and out that way, but a lot of that has been shut off since the two invasions of Crimea. They're trying to get more and more business for the ports in Latvia without too much success.
Okay. Again, if anybody has questions, please submit them via the chat function or the question and answer function, and we will try to get to them. This is Joel, the earlier question about the Estonian Diplomatic Corps. Joel says, sorry about missing the correct year. I meant the removal of the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Maria Yovanovitch, in May 2019. So I guess the question really is, how did the Latvians look at the administration for doing that type of thing based on what some people consider to be politics?
Yeah, I cannot speak specifically on that. I mean, in all my conversations with Latvian government officials, I can't recall a single instance where that was discussed, to be honest with you. Okay. So I can't speak to how the Latvian government may have felt.
Okay. Completely switching gears just a little bit. So Latvia is this amazingly rich and beautiful country. Latvians are extremely friendly. And while many still speak Russian, as you mentioned earlier, younger Latvians are now English speakers. How did you spend your free time while living there?
Well, traveling around the country a lot. That's part of the best part of being an ambassador is just traveling around talking to people. And you may go for an official trip to stay another day or two and spend a lot of time. You just mentioned the coastline before, beautiful beaches in Latvia, as the rest of the Baltics. Just great. So it's a wonderful place to be. The summer can't be beat with the long summers. Winter, not so much, but people are very friendly. Really enjoyed the time there.
So give us the inside scoop. Where are the hidden gems in Latvia that visitors certainly shouldn't miss?
Okay, well, you can speak to all the Baltics. I mean, the capital cities are just beautiful. Some of the coastal towns are definitely worth visiting. The old towns in Riga, Tallinn, those types of places are what one should see when one goes.
Okay. And tell us maybe just a little bit. So you served as ambassador for almost 4 years. Is that correct?
A little over 3 years, close to 3.5 years.
A little over 3 years. So what's it like to be an ambassador? What are the good points? What are the challenging points? What's it like to be the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to any country?
Well, I can only speak from my perspective. One, it's a lot. It's enjoyable and it's a lot of fun, but there's a tremendous amount of responsibility that comes not just for carrying out U.S. foreign policy in the country and coordinating with Washington, but being responsible for the men and women of the embassy and their well-being. We had about 55 Americans and their families living in Riga, plus another 120 Latvian employees. So there's a great responsibility there. But and also it's a busy job. A lot of public speaking, a lot of public representation, a lot of going out and meeting the people of the country, a lot of public speaking, a lot of I learned to how to be a public speaker, but also how to do TV interviews, those sorts of things I never thought I would do again. But it was a great honor representing the United States and representing whatever administration was in. Just like you, throughout our careers, we were non-political career people, and so it was an honor to serve the United States under various administrations.
Okay, another question here from our audience, Melinda and Fred Kuvik. How are Russian-speaking loyalties changing in Latvia over the past 35 years? Given time to appreciate independence and given the moves in Russia under Putin toward increased authoritarianism, are Russian speakers holding strong loyalties to Russia, or are they gaining loyalty to Latvia?
Yeah, I think over time, I can't really speak to that, not being a Latvian sociologist, but look, when I was there was never a concern from the Latvian government about, the loyalty of its citizens. People may be ethnic Russians or their mother tongue might be Russian, but they took great pride and they really liked living in an EU country because of the freedoms, because of the economic development, because of the opportunities that are open to them. And so I think that's how I would see Latvian, the total populace. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but the vast majority of the populace were, proud to be living in Latvia, proud to be Latvian citizens. And so yeah.
Okay. You talked earlier a little bit about the EU transition, in particular with some of the depopulation issues. But how has the EU transition gone? We've seen examples of it being very challenging because of the economic disparities at the time. But how has the EU transition gone with Latvia?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Mark. Sorry.
So as part of becoming a part of the EU, of course, there was quite a number of differences between Latvia at the time in 2004, I think you said, and the EU itself. And of course, part of any accession into the EU are certain economic indicators that need to be met. But as you talk about depopulation and the ability, especially for the younger generation now, to travel, work, and live throughout the EU, I guess maybe the question is, how has the transition into the EU changed things in Latvia?
Well, for the better. During the 1990s, I wouldn't say it's the Wild West, but in Latvia and the other Baltics, but because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, all those factories, all those jobs, there was nothing really there to replace it. And so it took, and the United States and other countries in the West sent a lot of development aid into those areas. I mean, we sent USAID officers there. We actually sent Peace Corps to the Baltics. And I actually had a former Peace Corps volunteer that was in Latvia that came to work in my embassy while I was there, returned home, as it were. But so that they got their feet under them. It's a long process for about a decade till they became members of the EU. And then they started slowly to develop economically. And then the great financial crash hit, the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and that really set things back for many years in Latvia, but helped accelerate this, migration, if you will, economic migration to the West. Now, some young people would come back, but a lot of people, and I know friends, they came back, their relatives or brothers and sisters, they stayed in Western Europe. And also, as you get older, as you're younger, you're more willing to move and have a young family. But also, there's a dynamic in the Baltics too, is that for older people who may be more tied to the land or the country, and also there's an economic problem, is that a lot of people are on very low pensions. And so these pensions are too low to really live the same quality of life or standard of living in Western Europe. So there's less incentive for the older generation to move. So it's been mostly a younger migration, economic migration.
Okay. And sort of adding to that, certainly part of what I see in Minnesota as a resident, but through other countries I've served in, is that the larger cities tend to do fairly well economically, while the smaller cities are very challenged, especially by countries transitioning out of the old Soviet system. Is that something that's happening in Latvia as well? And how does the Latvian government sort of address that issue? Or is that a bigger issue that gets addressed by EU membership?
Well, there is some EU development money that comes into all three Baltics, but it's not enough to really change the economic fortunes of the countries. And speaking of Latvia, you're right, it's the larger cities. I mean, Riga by far and away is the largest city in the country with about half the population of the country. But if you go through the Baltics, if you drive out in the countryside, especially in Latvia is a special case, you'll see a lot of abandoned factories and abandoned apartment complexes and stuff. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, all these jobs, all this industry just went with it. It may not have made economic sense to build, say, a sugar beet factory in Latvia, or a Soviet vans, motor vehicles there, or radios there. But they were jobs, they were factories there. And then when that went away, things did not get replaced in terms of the jobs and the economic activity.
Okay. And you talked earlier about USAID. Again, it's sort of taking a look at the first question is, did USAID have a robust program while you were ambassador?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah, no, not then. No. That was over. They had graduated. Sorry to speak over. Okay. They had graduated from that.
Okay. All right. Let's see. A question here from Martin Adams. Outside the US, NATO, and Russia, what other countries considered Latvia a priority for engagement, and what were their interests and priorities? Was Latvia a battleground for engagement interest with any other global rivals?
Yes, in a way, but only to a certain extent, because Latvia is a relatively small place. So it's not going to be, in terms of the geopolitical, realm, it's not going to be that big or an attractive target. That said, there was a lot of interest from China there, trade relationships, trying to develop political relationships with them. But it was never a priority for them. Before Finland and Sweden joined NATO, there was robust relationships between those two countries and the Baltics. I mean, because of the closeness. And historically, I mean, Estonia and Finland, for example, were very close, or have been very close, because of the short distance across the water, even during the Soviet times, because of the transmissions that the TV and radio transmissions that could come across from Finland into Estonia. So there's a special relationship between Finland and Estonia, just similar to what that historic close relationship there is between Lithuania and Poland.
Okay. Another question here from Linda and Fred Kuvik. Again, and this is something we haven't touched on really. How is higher education in Latvia? Was it shaped by the Soviet system? Is it integrating well into the European system?
Yeah, I can't speak how it was in the Soviet times, but there are some good universities in Riga, and they are well integrated into the broader European educational systems in terms of exchanges, in terms of programs, Erasmus, things like that. But I can't speak of what it was like under Soviet times.
Okay. Here's a question from Shelley Cross. And again, I'm sorry if you may have to help me out with the pronunciation of some of these cities. Could you comment on the social and economic situation in Daugavpils
Daugavpils, yeah.
and Latgal in general?
Yeah, down in Daugavpils is the second largest city in Latvia. It's on the Daugava River. It's down to the south. It's near the Russian border. Is quite a Russian-speaking, historically dominated area. That's where Mark Rothko's from, for all you art lovers out there. They have had a tougher time economically than, say, Riga, or maybe some other places on the coast like Ventspils. But the mayor down there, well, when I went down there, the mayor at the time was active in trying to attract investment. I think they were potentially hurt by the lessening of the economic relationship with Russia, especially after the two invasions of Ukraine. So they were having some tough times at when I was there.
Okay. And from that standpoint, is there, much like Ukraine, part of the issue in Ukraine is that there's clearly sort of a Russian-speaking East and a Ukrainian-speaking West in general. That's a difficult generalization to sort of put in there. But is that the case as you talk about Daugavpils? Is that sort of the case still in Latvia, or has that started to?
And the same with Estonia. The closer you are to the Russian border, the higher prevalence of the Russian population. Except the exception, as I mentioned before, Riga is about half Russian.
Okay. Sort of one last question here. As the former ambassador to Latvia, what are the 3 or 4 things you want Americans to know about the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Latvia, and maybe just about Latvia in general?
Well, Latvians and the Baltics writ large, they value the United States and they value that relationship. And they will do anything they can to accommodate us and our interests. They realize they don't pull a lot of economic weight. They pull a lot of strategic value in terms of their location, their geographic location. And they feel themselves very vulnerable. So they want to be very accommodating to us. They welcome our friendship. They welcome our help. And you cannot ask for a better international partner than the Baltics, and from my experience, Latvia. And if you have the opportunity to go to the Baltics, please do so. Don't go in the winter. Go in the summer. It's a wonderful place.
Yeah, I will second that. Having been able to spend time, I've spent time in all 3 Baltic countries, and they're amazing places, absolutely amazing places. And it is definitely worth a separate trip to sort of hit all 3, because it's just, you get a chance to get there and see things and meet Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, and you're shocked by how nice it really is. John, I want to thank you very much for your time tonight. It's been very eye-opening, a lot of great information, and I hope that you'll agree to come back at some point and talk more about your foreign service career and the Baltics.
Right. Thank you, Mark. And again, thank you, and thank you, Todd. Thank you, East-West Connections.
Thank you. Thank you both, Mark and John. You know, one of the things about doing programs like this is that countries aren't important until they're important. We never noticed much about Ukraine or Belarus until the war started. And we're always behind the fact in terms of what's happening across the world. And the tradition is that we need to get ahead and have knowledgeable people who can understand what the relationships are and what the importance of these countries are, and understand the idea of both the Russians' intent and the intent of the people within each of the areas, whether it be the Baltics, Eastern Europe, or Central Asia, because these are the people that will provide a sense of the growth and the idea of the relationships and the importance of what we consider central issues, just as Ukraine has become. And the Baltics have that potential, which is why I think it's so important to understand, what's happening there. I wish to thank Catherine Galligan and Sophia Shamal for their wonderful technical support. Also, I wish to thank again our co-sponsors, the Global Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, Macalester College Russian Studies Department, the Museum of Russian Art, and Zedekalo, the Russian media. For East-West Connections, we've got a number of programs that are planned that will be announced fairly soon, within the next 2 weeks. And what we're doing is we're trying to point issues out that are becoming important in terms of the trend lines in foreign relations and international partnerships. What we're seeing and we're afraid of is the idea of a splitting in terms of societies and civilizations where people cannot speak to others with an understanding of what the importance is in terms of secondary and tertiary relationships. That is dangerous for any country, especially the United States. And so the question of what we're doing is the idea of how do you stay ahead of the curve and how do you raise questions before they become public issues? And secondly, how do we get a communication going between people that understand this and the people of other nations? We're focused on citizen diplomacy, which is the idea of non-governmental actions that basically can bring about a change, which are just as important, frankly, as some of the diplomatic relationships, because you need both to provide relationships people to people and government to government. And so for that, I thank everybody who came tonight. I wish you a good night. And I hope that if you're interested in what we're doing, please check our website, the www.eastwestconnections.com. Participate. We're looking for other people for volunteers. We're extremely happy with the volunteers that we have, and we're seeking to expand that as we become more of a global system. So for that, thank you and good night. And I hope everybody has a good day.
Todd, I think we have some questions in the QA.
Okay, listen, if there are other questions, we can take them if John and Mark are okay on this.
Sure.
I've got one here from Teresa Hogan who just says thank you. And then from Claude Butner who says bravo and thank you.
Okay.
And also in the QA section, you could see there, Mark or John, do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, if you see another one. Do you see it, Mark?
I think we've hit all of them. I think we had 8 questions.
Oh yeah, okay, great.
And I think we've hit
Awesome.
them all.
Good. Listen, thank you very much. And thank you, Sophie, for reminding us of that. So for us, thank you and good night. John and Mark, great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Todd.
And don't forget, if you ever get to Minnesota, you have a free meal, which is the way of Minnesotans saying thank you, and you're invited into our house, which is the most religious thing that you can do in Minnesota.
All right. Look forward to it.
Listen, we hope so. And you're not that far from us, so please get out when you get a chance. Get up here and we'll show you what's left of a civilized society.
Yeah.
Good, Mark. We'll talk to you later. I'll talk to you next week. Hopefully, we'll have breakfast.
John, again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Great to see you.
Yeah, let's maybe try to catch up in the next couple of weeks. And
all right, thanks.
We had 49 participants besides us.
Wow, that's good.
Yes, and all of this will appear in social media too when we put the recordings together, and we'll get it so that you can send it to other people in the Foreign Service, seeing what it's like to actually be retired and relaxed.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great.
All right.
All right.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.